Mike, we're ready.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Marin Economic Briefing. Happy Monday. My name is Mike Blakeley, and I'm the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. We are a nonprofit organization in Marin County that provides research, data, and convenes stakeholders on Marin County's important issues such as economic vitality, social equity, and the environment. You can find out more about our activities by visiting our website at www.marineconomicforum.org. And while you're there, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, which would allow you to be invited to future events like this. And you can also find out about sponsorship opportunities and how to engage with our organization. The Marin Economic Briefing is a short presentation that we like to make on a monthly basis for the community to try to help understand all of the various economic data that's out there telling us about the health of our economy. Joining me today, as always, is Dr. Robert Eyler, who serves as the Chief Economist for the Marin Economic Forum. And what we like to do today is to take you through sort of the key economic indicators that policymakers and business leaders need to look at. Of course, these all come out at various times of the month, but we like to aggregate them. And then what we're going to present to you today is the Marin Recovery Data Tool, which is a set of indicators that we developed to really drill down and focus on the Marin economy and look at that benchmarked against the state and the nation. As always, we like to keep these to 30 minutes and let you get on with your day. This will be recorded. So for those of you that need to leave early or that want to circulate this to your colleagues afterwards, we'll be sending an email link to all those who register. And if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box. We'll do our best to get to them. But again, our goal is to keep this brief and to let you get on with the business at hand. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and he's going to take us through the numbers and tell us what's happening out there. Rob?
Thanks, Mike. You should be able to see my screen now, and I'm going to just provide an overview of what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. We now have election results, we believe. We'll see how things go the next few weeks or so in terms of the lawsuits, but we should assume right now that Joe Biden will be the 46th president and that we will, before the end of the year, probably have some fiscal package come forward. And part of what we're seeing in the markets is not only the potential of a vaccine, but also the idea that we will see a package now that we have a determination of the president. And when it goes forward, it will have some stimulative effect. We will see. We had jobs data come out last week for the US economy that suggested that the American unemployment rate right now is 6.9% as of October 31. And the state of California is recovering slightly slower than that, with some threat of having an increase in cases slowing down our economy even more going into the full fall and winter time. We will see how we adjust through that time in California versus the other states in the United States. But for Marin County, the jobs growth does continue. I'll show you some data, at least from the end of September, that suggests that there's been a little bit of tricky movement in terms of recovery for Marin County residents, but that over the next few months, we should see more complete recovery momentum. And then it's really just getting through fall and winter, and then we will see how a vaccine emerges and ultimately the uncertainty around doing business and having jobs come back turns after the beginning of the year. Housing remains a really strong market in terms of really not seeing much of a problem during the entire episode this year. And we will see how businesses become, somewhat subservient to whatever the state requirements are, and we're seeing some waffling around the states and the counties trying to pick which direction they want to go in terms of opening other businesses. But we're trying to watch not having any other business losses or as many business losses as we may have had otherwise. Avoiding another generalized shelter in place is going to help our businesses come out of this much more cleanly. Some data came through in the last couple of weeks on gross domestic product. So at the national level, I'm showing you the annualized data, and here are the last 4 recessions, including the one we're in. So the numbers are very violent in terms of looking at what's called seasonally adjusted annual rate of growth. This gives you a little bit different perspective on how recessions see the economy slow down over the last 4 recessions, and then also how they start to pick back up. So on the far right-hand side, you can see that while there was a major change in the second quarter, the third quarter is still down from last year, but quite a bit less down than it was in the second quarter of 2020, which is good. It suggests that we are slowly coming out of the hole, but we still have some way to go. Generally speaking, forecasts, and I'll show you a little bit of this in a minute, forecasts are suggesting we will not be back to early 2020 numbers in both the capacity of the economy to generate gross domestic product or overall employment until sometime mid 2022 or perhaps 2023. And part of that's because the American economy has shown recovery. It could have been a lot longer than that in terms of most forecasts. But you can see here where, as in terms of the October numbers that just came out last week at the national level, looking back 1 year, the losses have now gone into the single-digit percentage change, except for a few standout places. And that is, you look at the far right. The travel industry getting hammered this year has affected in sort of concentric circles around travel, hotel, which is in the center of travel, but then also food services and drinking places, which is a fancy term for bars and restaurants. When people are not traveling, we don't have as much demand for eating out or going out. And even though we maybe are going out a little bit more in California as residents, folks coming from national and international destinations to come here has slowed so much that the hiring has been very slow to come back. So those are still at the national level relatively low numbers in terms of job losses, and we need to see those pick back up, or there may be some structural change, and I'll talk about that in a little while in those specific industries. With respect to the forecast at the national level, the Atlanta Federal Reserve does a weekly forecast, which it calls GDP Now, and it combines its own economist forecast along with the blue chip forecast in terms of, you can see here that blue line is the median forecast of the blue chip forecast, and then the gray area around it is basically the error band around that forecast. The GDP Now estimate was very close to what the Bureau of Economic Analysis actually came out with for the third quarter of 2020. And so looking at the Atlanta Fed estimate now is it's barely over 3% for the fourth quarter. So this is the movement toward the end of the year and what it sees in quarter four. Well, generally speaking, that gigantic jump was a great coming out of a party, if you will, in the summer. But it leads then to what's going to happen over the entire year. The IMF has actually looked at the American economy slowing down by 4.5% in 2020, meaning that we've actually lost capacity to generate income. And then 2021 through 2023, this slow get back where they do not see a repeat, or let's say a so-called double dip recession. And most of the Federal Reserve branches see basically the same picture. So while the fourth quarter may be much slower than originally predicted, mainly because we have not got a stimulus package in place yet, and originally forecasts were a little bit more sanguine because we saw a package coming out before the end of September and it didn't happen. We will see how the first quarter of 2021's forecast picks up a little bit if we see a second federal stimulus package come through. And there is that current estimate. Again, notice that click down in the blue line as we entered October of the blue chip consensus, primarily happening because we did not get a deal done in Washington. One of the key statistics that transitions us from the national to the state level in data is looking at continued unemployment insurance claims. The blue data, which is on the left-hand side, is the total number of weeks, and in fact, both these data points are the total number of weeks. This is actually from the beginning of January. The total number of weeks we're paying in terms of unemployment insurance. So think of this as the aggregate level of folks that are out of work or claiming unemployment insurance. And you can see for the US, we peaked in early May and have been slowly sliding down ever since. And so this in a sense is what you could call a modified V-shaped recovery, because we are getting recovery, but we picked up really quickly in terms of losses and have been slowly getting gains back. Now for California, which is on the right-hand axis, it was a very flat summer, meaning that we had some initial peaking in terms of the number of people that asked for unemployment insurance, and then it faded and then flattened over summer. A lot of that's because we didn't open up as fast as other parts of the country. And now we're all kind of moving in the same direction, as you can see on the far right-hand side. And these data actually are through about 10 days ago. So these are very recent data and are point counts of people that are actually on unemployment insurance by a person. We need these data to continue to go down to continue to have jobs recovery. And so one concern is that we won't see as much of this as we enter the next phase of recovery in terms of the fast slide down. It'll start to flatten out again. We will see. Hopefully we will turn the corner in the next year relatively well. Here's California from September. Just to kind of contrast what we saw at the US level, this is California. Same basic idea, though farmers, mainly because of smoke and fires in California, September was a little bit tricky on the farm side and saw a big hit where August was actually pretty good as far as comparing to 2019. But if you look at the far right-hand side, leisure and hospitality, which is accommodation in food services and drinking places, or bars, restaurants, and hotels, that combination very similar to the US, but other services, which is a bunch of personal services, nail salons, hair salons, estheticians, nonprofit organizations that don't have anything to do with healthcare, that's also still basically 20% down from last year in terms of the number of workers. And a lot of that's because jobs are proximate to each other, and California's been a little bit slower to open back up. So the combination of these industries and the changes in jobs since last year look somewhat similar to the national level, but for California, where the risk is a little bit more in leisure and hospitality and in other services, that's what's dragging down the California data. Now, Mike alluded to our data recovery tool, or our recovery data tool, and looking forward for October. These are the latest data, and so taking those data I just showed you and then thinking more about how Marin County compares, this is what's going on with the September data. We won't get jobs data for October for the state and for the counties for another couple of weeks. But if you see here that we have now 6.5% seasonally adjusted, or not seasonally adjusted data, I'm sorry, for Marin County, which is very strong. It's one of the strongest unemployment rates right now in California, and California is still right around 11 at 10.8%. But another issue, which is something economists have started to focus on a little bit, even though it comes in almost every single recession otherwise, is the change in the labor force. So changing labor force for California is about 3.8% from last year, meaning that those that are either actively seeking work or working has been reduced by almost 4% for California, but almost 5.5% for Marin County since last year in September. What that suggests is two things. One, that people have either retired or they might be moving on to some other place. And by moving on to some other place, they're collecting unemployment, but their address is some other place, or they're working some other place, and they've just left the state or the county. But a third phenomenon to watch out for is that people are actually choosing to leave the labor force because of childcare concerns or some other rationale where they're just not feeling very good. In other words, you could think of it as sort of a discouraged worker effect, where they haven't left the area, they just have left the labor force. So it'll take us about 12 to 18 months to actually sort all that, let's say, outbound migration, and also whether or not people have chosen to stay out of the labor force for the time being for childcare reasons. As the census data emerges, we'll see how the census data emerges this year. But it's something to watch in terms of available labor. In terms of jobs, to compare what we just saw, I'm going to walk you from April through to September. And when you walk through this by month, it should show you this sort of slow, easy recovery period. So here are all those industries. April was the big bad month. Then May saw some comeback. June saw some comeback. July was a little flatter. August saw a little comeback. And then September also saw a little comeback from Marin County. So just like the state, leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, and hotels, other services, those other services I talked about, to a certain extent, retail has been a little slower also to come back, as well as wholesale. But generally speaking, most of the problems in Marin County lie in those service areas that we saw at the state level and also at the national. Why? Because the risk in this recession has been centered on those types of jobs. Now, what we're concerned about is whether or not we're going to see a so-called K-shaped recovery, and I'll come back to this in a minute, where low-wage workers and middle-wage workers, most of which are concentrated in those services that are somewhat personal or serve both local residents and visitors, may see structural change. And while we're seeing those job losses heavy in those lower wage areas or lower wage workers, there's not going to be a structural reason why they would come back very quickly. More on that in a minute. Let's now transition to look at continued unemployment insurance claims at the county level. And these are through the end of September. The data I showed you before showed California and the US contrasted to each other. Now I'm going to show you through September, where if you think about the California data I showed you before, it's probably a harbinger for most of the counties in California, but there are some anomalies around the Bay Area. So this is from January 2019 to the end of September. And the reason I'm showing you this is because you're going to see this long flat period where not a lot of change took place as we were rolling through toward 2020, and then some wild movement once coronavirus hit and we started to see our labor markets contract. This is Marin County. So one of the concerns about Marin County, not only is that we went up, but because we've had this sort of slow movement back out from the recession, or from the beginning of the recession, we've actually saw the summer we picked back up a little bit in terms of the number of people that were going on unemployment versus coming off. So let me take 30 seconds and explain this a little more completely. These data ultimately show you the net flow of people on and off unemployment insurance. And when you see that pick back up, it could be that folks lost their job a second time or suddenly claimed unemployment because they couldn't hold on any longer. But regardless, it suggests that there's more people out there who need the unemployment insurance in net versus, let's say, earlier in the summer. And in the October data, we're hoping, following the data we saw for California above, we will see this tick back down. Now let's quickly go through some other areas to show you some comparatives. Here's Napa. Here's San Francisco, very similar to Marin County. Here's Solano County, somewhat similar to Marin County also. Mendocino County, Sonoma County, to show you a little bit north, and the labor market's both super rural in terms of Mendocino County, but not so rural in terms of Sonoma. Here's California, which is the state average, basically what we just saw above. And then here's the US. Now notice that from all these places in California, specifically in the Bay Area, we are not the same movement as the US, same picture we saw above. So we need these data to trend down to really get labor market recovery. But like I just said before, one of our concerns is there's a certain portion of the labor market that will not recover quickly. Here is the genesis of the so-called K-shaped recovery. These data come from what's called tracktherecovery.org, or what's called the Opportunity Tracker at Harvard University. An economist named Raj Chetty has done an enormous amount of work putting together a bunch of social media sites and a lot of big databases to try to really grind down on how businesses are remaining open or not, and whether or not people are getting back to work and in what wage levels. So this is where you heard about a K-shaped recovery. Notice the red line is relatively high wages, and I'm saying high wages because it's basically $60,000 a year and more. Middle wage is $27,000 to $60,000, and then below $27,000 is low wages. And you can see that there's a real split here so far. And this is actually just as the beginning of September. The data haven't changed that much at the state or national level, and all the pictures basically look the same. There's the K-shaped recovery in its full glory. And whether or not we can get that blue line to start ticking back up is a big concern, because if we can't, it suggests structural change in services, meaning that you're not seeing hiring and seeing a contraction in businesses, which from an economic development standpoint is the worst case scenario in recession. You don't want to lose the capacity to rebuild incomes and jobs on the other side of a recession. So we're watching this closely to see if we start to see all three of these lines evolve up over time. But for Marin County, this is what the picture is through the beginning of September, and those are the latest data. Now, as I said earlier, a bright spot has been housing. Now, housing bright spots come with some caveats, but let's check this out. This is from 1 year ago in September. So you can see here that compared to last year and then 1 year ago, oh, I'm sorry, 2 years ago, this is 1 year ago, here's 2 years ago. And unfortunately, I have this mislabeled. I apologize for that. I should have said September 2020. The idea here is that in California, we saw 6.8% growth in the median home price. Wow, that is amazing, where a lot of that period now, as time has moved along since March, is in recession. And you can see on the far right-hand side, Marin County has gone up by 8.3%, which is amazing. Well, most of that growth over the last 2 years happened in the last year, which again, is just shocking given that we've been in recession. But what's happened? Well, two things have happened that have been absolutely critical. One is rental prices were relatively high. So there's a large incentive for folks to take on existing home units when they become available and move out of relatively high price rental and start generating an asset out of their home. The second is interest rates were dropped dramatically, which then gives a second incentive to move into owning a home or potentially upgrading, as the case may be. So we expected some of this. Economists generally did not expect it to be this robust. But the big question is this, and this is critical. As a caveat, we know there's a lot of people who've had mortgage deferment. And what caused so much craziness in the last recession was that we had a lot of people put their houses up for sale simultaneously because they got behind on payments, and then the labor market stopped providing returns to keep them in their homes. And when supply exceeds demand, prices want to go down. So far, demand is exceeding supply. Whether or not it continues, if payment deferment leads to suddenly putting existing homes up because you just can't stay up with payments once the deferment fades, that's a critical question going into the 2021 and 2022 years with respect to housing. We will see. Now, from a building permits perspective, this is the 12-month run rate in Marin County from December 2002 to the end of September. And you can see that there's been some wild movement in Marin County. However, going into 2020 on the far right-hand side, you can see that things picked up. This is the transition from before the recession, the big dip during the recession, then kind of coming out, going into 2020. And that little baby tick up at the very far right-hand side means that we're starting to see a little bit more developer activity, mostly in multifamily in Marin County. But the point is that we're seeing some developers take on some more construction, seeing the incentives to do so for Marin County, which is somewhat intriguing, but it could be because they're seeing people move out of the city and wanting to move to Marin County where the quality of life is a little bit better. and they're getting ready for that, as well as just having projects move from idea to fruition while the cost of credit is relatively low. Now, one other piece that's a little bit tricky is in the taxable sales. And I want to show you these data these are relatively new. They just came out a few weeks ago for Marin County and actually all 58 counties and the state of California. This looks at the shock from the second quarter 2028, 2029. So this is, or 2019, I'm sorry. This is 1 year ago compared to 2 years ago. This is the first quarter of 2020 compared to 2019. And then this is the second quarter. So this really showcases the contraction in local spending that took place, mainly because these businesses were closed. But at the same time, if you're thinking about it from an economic development standpoint, and these are the data that reflect revenues that come into retail that primarily sell taxable items, how do you hang on as a business under these percentage change conditions? If I turned off 55 to 60% of your revenue as a business, it's very tough to stay in business. So if you start adding up the data we've seen before this slide, we have job losses that are primarily in services that are bars, restaurants, hotels, and other services. We're seeing a contraction, and also in retail. We're seeing a contraction across retail, which is likely mirrored in restaurants. And you can see restaurants here as food services and drinking places, which is fourth from the left, but also in other services. All those places that were closed, the revenue contraction, all that tied up together, will we see structural change? That's the critical economic development question in this recession. Well, that then leads to talking about commercial real estate. And commercial real estate is looking somewhat tricky in terms of a forecast. These are the latest data from Newmark, Knight and Frank. And through the end of the third quarter, if you look at the forecast, the data themselves are what they are given the Marin marketplace for office, but it's the right-hand side where the blue arrows are that are the most important. Pretty much flat on inventory availability rate and net absorption, both going down in their forecast, and everything else basically flat in terms of construction and new space. Pretty much a flat market. Now, if you talk to folks on the front line, they'll tell you that there's a lot of so-called tire kicking and sniffing around from the urban area of the Bay Area, thinking about migrating up and taking on leases. But I think we're still in this sort of feeling out process in terms of commercial real estate with respect to now that the elections are over and we figure out what we're going to work maybe after the first of the year. A lot of that will then potentially lead to final decision making with respect to commercial real estate, more specifically in office. We have to expect that retail is going to have a very tough time after the first of the year unless we really see a roaring economic comeback. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Mike. Mike, thank you. And folks, I'll be happy to take your questions here in a minute.
Thanks very much, Rob. And let me just take a moment to remind the audience that not only will this recording be available, but you can go to our website and you can see the Marin data recovery tool as a file that you can either download or just review it. We update that as soon as we have our own data updated. Rob, thank you. Obviously, a lot of data to run through in a very short period of time. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I'm just going to sort of move towards the next slide, Rob, which is really when we take this data, we're always asking ourselves the question, what do we know and what do we think we have to fix? And so for that purpose, MEF usually focuses on three main areas. The first one is on workforce. And as has been obvious since the get-go of this pandemic, those in the lower wage occupations have suffered the most, and that's where the losses are very visible. But the question is how to get this population back to work. And as Rob mentioned in his presentation, there are cases where people have been rehired and then lost that job again, particularly in these lower wage jobs. And so one of the interesting observations that we've had is that in the beginning of this, there was this sort of subjective determination of what an essential worker is. And that was everything from a grocery store cashier all the way up to a doctor. But nonetheless, those are these essential workers is where we've seen a significant amount of job loss. Whereas if you think back to a slide that Rob presented earlier, where you saw the most, quote, resilient jobs were in things such as financial services, technology. So it really begs this question of, well, what really are the jobs that are essential to keep things going? If some of these higher end professional services jobs are the ones that have been able to maintain. That suggests that they've maintained because people need them as well. So aren't they also essential? But what it really does is raise the question about how you invest in your workforce coming out of a recession. We obviously don't want to invest in getting people back to $15 an hour jobs. So the question becomes, how can you take individuals who have lost their jobs in these low wage, low skill occupations and find a way to provide them the training they need to move up the ladder into better paying jobs. The other thing that we look at are business sectors and commercial real estate. Now, Rob just touched on commercial real estate, so I won't spend time there. In the beginning of the pandemic, most of you will remember people declaring the death of the office and what are we going to do with all these hollowed out office buildings. That's not necessarily the case here in Marin County. In fact, we've seen prices move up and inventory move down, really concentrated in the Class A, which is the nicer office space category. But what we've also seen is the retail space where the small businesses that have unfortunately had to go out of business, those spaces remain vacant. So the question that we're asking is, okay, commercial real estate, that's going to play itself out, but what's happening with the retail space and how are downtowns going to manage these vacancies, and do they need to maybe reimagine what those spaces can be used for? In San Francisco, they just passed something called Proposition H, which really relaxed the rules and regulations in terms of how retail and street front building can be used. And it not only expedited permitting processes, but it opened up what types of businesses can go in there. And so that's maybe a question that jurisdictions in Marin County need to be asking. What can we allow to go into some of these main streets that maybe we didn't before because we've got these vacancies now and we don't want to have empty storefronts. In terms of business sectors, you know, what's also very obvious is the huge difference in job loss between personal services and professional services. In fact, in Marin County, you're talking about over 20% job loss in the personal services category versus 5% job loss in professional services. So again, on this question of workforce and where you want to invest your dollars, and in terms of coming back, what kind of businesses you want to attract and jobs you want to create in Marin County, it's very clear that if you're going to achieve resiliency and try to give people an opportunity to move up the economic ladder, that we need to focus a little bit more on how to create more professional service jobs here in Marin County. And then the final point I want to make is in terms of, you know, what's it going to take to restore and grow the economy coming out of this? MEF has said since day one that this recovery is going to depend very much on consumers. And what we're seeing now, not only in Marin, but in other states that are way ahead of Marin County in terms of reopening, is that it's not just a matter of is the restaurant able to be open or not. What we are seeing is that consumers still, to some extent, do not feel safe enough to resume certain activities. Over the weekend, I heard that AMC movie theater chain, you know, despite a go of it and despite reopening in some states, is more than likely looking at closing down. And so these types of businesses that rely on people being in indoor spaces, we're at real risk of, despite the fact we allow them to participate in those activities, they're not for health and safety reasons. And we just can't predict when that's going to get better, even when there is a vaccine, which of course this morning there was very positive news on that front. And then the final question that we're really trying to look at in terms of coming out of this is, we know unfortunately that we're going to lose some businesses. And we also know that some businesses that were already struggling a little bit because of normal dynamics, such as the shift to digital or just changing consumer preferences, those businesses have, you know, their futures are even more uncertain, or their demise has even been accelerated by this pandemic. You know, are we going to make, you know, heroic efforts now to try to save those businesses and keep them as a major role in our economy, or do we need to consider what types of businesses are not only emerging but actually growing through this, and look at how Marin County supports those types of businesses? MEF is not advocating either way. Let me be clear. We know that we are a business, we are an economy of small businesses, and many of these small businesses have been through recessions, floods, other types of really crises, and that is because our residents and our community wants those types of businesses. But we also need to find a way to make sure that we are accommodating the new types of trends that are emerging, that we are enabling an environment where entrepreneurs who want to start new types of businesses can do that. And so that's what we're looking at. How can we, help people understand what types of incentives and regulations and other programs we need to put in place to make sure that we have a pathway towards growth. So I see that there are a number of questions in the chat. I'm just going to try to take a one or two of these, and I'll invite Rob to come in to maybe talk about these. Rob, the question that we all need to know and are all dealing with is, diminished tax revenues. So where are we seeing those impact municipal budgets right now in Marin County?
So obviously sales taxes being down is not good. Property taxes look good, which is great. It's one of the main ways in which we finance local areas. So that's been good because prices of houses have not contracted as we saw in 2007, 8, and 9. The state budget has remained relatively stable because equity markets and, let's say, higher income earners have kind of kept their income. So all those pieces, really, it's sales tax and TOT where most of the hurt has happened thus far, and we should expect that to somewhat linger into 2021.
Okay, thank you. And we're up on time, but I'm going to take one last question here because this is something that is on the front of everybody's minds. How will restaurants survive serving public outdoors in inclement weather? So I want to take this question. I don't have the answer to that. Restaurants are being very creative in how they're addressing it. But what I want to assure everybody who's listening in is that the various chambers of commerce in Marin County have a very active dialogue with the county and with their city managers in terms of how they can accommodate this. We have a lot of restaurants in Marin County. Nobody wants to see them go. And there's a lot of effort behind the scenes between public and private sector on how to accommodate that. So while we don't have the answers just yet, please understand that's a very active dialogue, and I expect that we'll see some creative solutions. So with that, we are up against time, and I want to thank everybody for joining. I do want to note that we have had a growing audience for these briefings, and I'm really happy for that, and Rob is doing a great job in finding the data that we need to know. I encourage everybody to spread the word about these briefings. There will be another one in December, but I also encourage you, if you have comments of your own or questions of your own, to reach out to the Marin Economic Forum and ask us. We want to have an active dialogue with our community. And it looks like we've gotten some more certainty over the weekend. And hopefully we're on a pathway towards more certainty, which is what businesses like. And with that, I'm going to close it for today and thank everybody again. A web link with the recording is coming your way later today. And stay safe out there. Thanks for joining.